Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take stacks of research, notes, reports, and really pull out the core ideas for you.
That's the goal.
And today we're jumping into a really detailed study. It's called Contextualizing the Scope, Scale, and Speed of Energy Pathways Towards Sustainable Development in Africa.
Quite a title.
It is. And it looks right at Africa's energy future, facing these huge challenges, climate change on one side, energy crises on the other.
Exactly. And this study asks, a really fundamental question. Can Africa actually steer its energy system towards genuine sustainable development? It's critical given everything that's happening.
Okay, so let's unpack that. My understanding from looking through this study is that it lays out two pretty different paths forward.
Right. One where fossil fuels kind of keep dominating.
And another one built more around renewables. And the thing that jumped out at me right away was this sort of key finding, that going green, focusing on renewables, might not just be, the climate-friendly choice. It might actually be cheaper.
Yeah, that's a huge takeaway from this study. And to really get why that's so significant, we kind of need to see where things stand now, energy-wise, in Africa. This research gives us a good baseline.
Okay, so what's the picture today? What does this study tell us?
Well, if you look just at electricity generation, fossil fuels are pretty dominant still. Fossil methane is about 39%, coal is around 30%, and then you've got hydropower at 17%.
Okay.
But, and this is important, when you look at the total primary energy supply, everything, not just electricity, bioenergy is actually the biggest piece, like 45%.
Bioenergy. Okay, that sounds potentially good, maybe sustainable.
You'd think so. But,
Yeah.
well, this study points out that most of that bioenergy is used in pretty unsustainable ways, mostly for cooking.
Ah.
Yeah, especially in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
And that brings a whole host of problems, health-wise, environment-wise.
Right. So not quite the green picture you might initially imagine. And this study also talks about energy access, which is a massive issue, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Access to electricity across the continent, it's low,
Yeah.
like 56%. That means, what, around 580 million people just don't have electricity.
Wow.
And it's even tougher when you look at clean cooking. We're talking about 900 million people lacking access to clean ways to cook their food.
That's staggering, just huge numbers. It really frames the need for change, doesn't it?
Definitely.
So with that context, this study makes a strong case for Africa to essentially leapfrog, to bypass the heavy fossil fuel stage and go straight for renewables. What's the thinking there?
Yeah, the rationale laid out in this study is pretty compelling. The idea is by choosing renewables now, Africa can actually spark new industries, create jobs, drive socioeconomic development,
Okay.
and at the same time, avoid getting locked into high carbon pathways.
Mm-hmm.
Avoid building infrastructure that'll commit them to emissions for decades.
It's like they get a chance to avoid the path some other big economies took. This study mentions China, Indonesia, India. They're growing really tied to fossil fuels, wasn't it?
Exactly. Those countries achieved incredible things, lifting millions out of poverty, but it came with a heavy reliance on coal, massive emissions. This study argues Africa doesn't have to follow that exact script.
And the timing is right, maybe? Because the tech has improved so much?
Precisely. This study really emphasizes that. The pace of improvement in renewables, especially solar, and the cost reductions, it's just unprecedented. It makes that leapfrogging idea much more realistic now than, say, 10 or 20 years ago.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. This study doesn't just talk about renewables, it lays out a specific vision. They call it a true zero emission pathway. What does that actually involve?
So this vision, according to the research, really hinges on solar, PV, photovoltaic panels combined with battery storage systems and also electrolyzers.
Right. Solar and batteries make sense for clean electricity. What about electrolyzers?
Electrolyzers are key for making green hydrogen. Basically, you use clean electricity, like from solar, to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. That green hydrogen can then be used as fuel or in industrial processes cleanly.
And Africa's geography plays a big role here. The study calls it a greenfield for renewables.
Absolutely. The continent is just incredibly rich in renewable resources, especially solar. It's almost tailor-made for deploying these kinds of technologies on a massive scale, which is a central point in this study.
Now, the speed of this transition seems really critical in the analysis. This study talks about needing rapid decarbonization, particularly in the power sector, to avoid that carbon lock-in.
That's right. The period after 2030 is flagged in this study as absolutely crucial. The research models different futures based on policy choices. You have the best policy scenarios, or BPS,
Okay.
which show really deep decarbonization happening after 2030. And then you have the current policy scenarios, CPS, which, well, tend to stick with a more carbon-heavy mix.
And this study drills down even further, looking at scenarios with and without factoring in carbon costs, right?
Yeah, exactly. So they analyze four main ones: BPS, BPS without carbon costs, BPSO, basically CPS, and CPS without carbon costs, CPS-OCC. It helps tease out how much policy versus pure economics might drive things.
And a really concrete policy difference this study highlights is about building new power plants.
Yes. In those best policy scenarios, the BPS ones, this study assumes no new coal, oil, or nuclear plants get built. Existing ones get phased out. Gas turbines are okay, though, because they could potentially run on clean fuels later.
Whereas the current policy scenarios, the CPS,
They allow for new fossil fuel and nuclear plants to be built. So a very different trajectory depending on policy choices made now and in the near future.
it's also interesting this study apparently uses a changing cost of capital over time. That sounds more realistic than assuming it stays the same.
It is, yeah. That's a neat methodological detail in this study. Recognizing that the cost of borrowing money might change as the transition unfolds gives, I think, a more grounded economic picture for these pathways.
Okay, let's talk tech. Solar PV, solar panels seem to be the star player by 2050 in basically all the scenarios this study looked at.
Oh, absolutely dominant. Depending on the scenario, this study projects solar PV providing anywhere from like 42% up to a massive 88% of total electricity supply by 2050.
Wow.
Yeah. It comes down to Africa having fantastic solar conditions almost everywhere, plus those plummeting costs we talked about. This study really confirms how well-suited solar is regionally.
But it's not only solar, right? This study shows wind and hydro still play important roles, maybe more in some areas than others.
For sure. Wind power is significant, especially in the BPS scenarios analyzed by this study. You see big potential in places like the Sahara, the Horn of Africa, parts of Southern Africa.
Okay.
And hydropower, particularly in Central and East Africa, remains a key part of the mix in this study's projections. They kind of complement solar, help balance things out.
Right, which brings up a huge point. If you're relying so much on variable sources like solar and wind, how do you keep the lights on consistently? Reliability and flexibility must be major considerations in this study.
Huge, yeah. You can't just switch everything to solar and wind without thinking about how to manage the fact that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. This study tackles that head on. Well, one thing is the level of detail in their modeling. They use hourly time steps, which lets them really simulate the ups and downs. And then this study proposes several concrete technical solutions for flexibility.
Okay, like what? Storage seems like the obvious one.
Definitely. Energy storage is massive in this study's vision. Mostly batteries, utility-scale big ones, and smaller ones too, maybe even at homes or businesses. This study projects they'll supply all the electricity storage needed, somewhere between 415 and 1,800 terawatt hours by 2050.
That's a huge range, but a lot of storage either way.
It is, and it's feasible because battery costs have just fallen off a cliff. The study also mentions storing energy as heat or in e-fuels, but batteries are the main story for electricity storage.
What else besides storage? This study mentions connecting grids across regions.
Yes, transmission interconnection, basically building strong power lines between countries and regions that lets you share power. So if it's really sunny in one area and cloudy in another, you can shift the solar power around.
Ah, optimizing resources.
Exactly. It helps smooth out those variations. This study sees a lot of electricity trading happening, especially in the BPS scenarios, with some regions becoming major exporters.
Okay, this next one in the study is interesting. Energy curtailment. That sounds like wasting energy.
It does sound counterintuitive, yeah.
No.
Curtailment means sometimes deliberately not using all the renewable energy you could generate.
Why would you do that?
Well, this study suggests that in the BPS scenarios, having a certain amount of managed curtailment, maybe 5–7% by 2050, can actually be cheaper than building even more storage or transmission lines just to capture every last drop of potential energy. It becomes a low-cost flexibility tool.
Okay. A trade-off then. And then there's sector integration, using electricity for more things, basically.
Exactly. This is central to the carbon-neutral BPS scenario in this study. The idea is electricity becomes the main energy carrier, not just for lights and appliances, but for heating, transport, even making water through what they call Power to X or PTX.
Power to X. Let's break that down. Power to heat.
Yeah. So instead of burning gas for heat, you use electricity directly, maybe with efficient heat pumps. This study sees that, plus some sustainable bioenergy and maybe some e-fuels, meeting most heating needs by 2050 in the BPS scenario.
And power to mobility. Transport's a tough one.
It is. This study projects a big shift. More electric vehicles, obviously battery EVs, but also using electricity indirectly to make green hydrogen or synthetic fuels, so-called FTL fuels, for things like trucks, ships, planes maybe. Much less reliance on petrol and diesel in the BPS compared to the CPS.
Power to water, that's desalination, making fresh water from seawater.
Yes, crucial in many parts of Africa. And this study shows it can be done sustainably using renewable electricity.
And finally, power to fuel. This seems really important for industries that are hard to electrify directly, based on this study.
Absolutely critical. Think long-haul flights, shipping, making cement, steel. You need energy-dense fuels. So this study sees a big role for e-fuels made using renewable electricity and, crucially, captured CO2.
And Africa could be good at this.
Huge potential, according to this study, especially for green hydrogen production. Africa could become a major hub for these green fuels. The research projects a massive build-out of electrolyzers and other conversion tech. It even briefly mentions direct air capture, DAC, for getting that CO2.
Wow, okay. That's a really comprehensive technical picture from this study, but the cost. You mentioned earlier the green path might be cheaper.
Yeah, this is probably the headline finding from this study. The analysis shows that the total cumulative cost of the carbon-neutral BPS pathway by 2050 is actually around 50% lower than the cost of the fossil fuel-heavy CPS pathway.
50% lower. That's huge. It really flips the script on the cost of climate action.
It really does.
So what's driving that cost difference beyond just cheaper solar panels? Is it avoiding fuel costs or...
That's a big part of it, even if you ignore the cost of CO2 emissions entirely. So look at the BPS and OCC versus CPS and OCC scenarios in this study. The renewable heavy BPS pathway is still about 41% cheaper.
Okay, so it's not just about potential carbon taxes, it's fundamental economics.
Pretty much. This study highlights that the cost structure is totally different. In the BPS, most of the cost is upfront capital investment in solar, wind, batteries, grids, but then the fuel, sun, and wind is free.
Right.
In the CPS, you still have capital costs for power plants, but then you have decades of ongoing, potentially volatile fossil fuel costs. Those fuel costs really dominate the total expense in the CPS scenarios, according to this study.
And the emissions difference is obviously massive, too.
Night and day. This study quantifies it. The BPS scenarios get very close to zero emissions from the energy sector by mid-century. The CPS scenarios, well, they continue to link economic activity with significant carbon emissions.
So Africa has this opportunity, and this study points out some specific natural advantages.
It does, the amazing solar resources, as we mentioned. And this study notes that solar seems pretty resilient to climate change impacts compared to, say, hydropower, which can be vulnerable to droughts or even wind patterns that might shift.
That's a good point. And this study touches on potential issues with hydro, too, right? Sociopolitical stuff.
Yeah, large hydro dams can sometimes be complex projects, involve displacing people, environmental impacts. Solar and wind might face fewer of those kinds of hurdles, though land use is still a consideration.
Right, land use. Do these huge solar and wind farms take up too much space? What does this study say?
This study addresses that. It calculates the land needed and finds it's actually a pretty small percentage of Africa's total land area. Plus, there's potential for co-location, putting solar panels over canals or on farmland, agrivoltaics, or floating on hydro reservoirs. So, manageable, according to this research.
So technically, this high renewable future outlined in this study is feasible, no showstoppers.
That's a key message from this study. There are no fundamental technical barriers. A reliable, affordable, high renewable energy system is achievable in Africa.
And Africa might even have some advantages. Lower grid requirements.
Yeah, the relatively stable solar conditions across much of the continent actually mean slightly less complex grid balancing might be needed compared to some other regions. This study highlights the importance of those PV storage hybrids, the mix of solar, wind, hydro working together.
But the grid build-out is still essential.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Large-scale transmission and regional cooperation are non-negotiable elements discussed throughout this study.
Okay, this study also includes a table, I think it was table 10, comparing the scenarios in 2050. What are some of the really stark differences that jump out?
Yeah, that table is useful. You see huge differences in, like, the share of renewables in total energy much higher in BPS. Electricity demand actually goes up significantly in BPS.
Up? Why is that?
Because of that sector integration. We talked about electrifying transport, heat, industry. So overall, energy use might become more efficient, but electricity use itself grows. You also see massive differences in installed power capacity, obviously much more renewables in BPS. And the type of hydrogen produced, mostly green hydrogen in BPS versus potentially gray or blue hydrogen from fossil fuels and CPS. E-fuels, bioenergy use. It paints very different pictures of the 2050 energy system.
It sounds like a transformation, but transformations cost money. What about investment?
This study is clear. Both pathways need massive investment. Sticking with fossil fuels isn't cheap either. You need new plants, pipelines, import infrastructure.
Right.
But the argument in this study is that investing in the deep decarbonization pathway, the BPS, creates new value. New industries around manufacturing renewables, producing green fuels, exporting them potentially. It could mean more energy independence, more jobs.
So becoming a self-sufficient green hydrogen economy, maybe even an exporter, that's the potential this study sees.
That's the vision, yes. Leveraging those amazing renewable resources not just for domestic use, but potentially as a new economic engine.
And beyond the big picture economics, this study connects the transition to improving people's lives directly. Access to energy services.
Absolutely. Think back to those 900 million people without clean cooking. Shifting to electricity or sustainable bioenergy for cooking has huge health benefits, environmental benefits.
Right. Reduces indoor air pollution.
Exactly. And solar PV is great for getting power to remote areas too, off-grid solutions as well as strengthening the main grid. This study links it all back to making energy access sustainable, affordable, equitable.
So pulling it all together, what are the big policy takeaways from this deep dive into contextualizing the scope, scale, and speed of energy pathways towards sustainable development in Africa? What needs to happen?
Well, this study stresses that institutions matter. You need efficient governments, strong regional cooperation like through the African Continental Free Trade Area to make this happen smoothly.
Right.
You also need to build the workforce, the skills for this new green economy. And critically, you need political will, progressive policies at all levels.
What kind of policies specifically does this study point towards?
Things that prioritize solar PV, grid connections, storage, green fuel production, but also policies that actively disincentivize new fossil fuel projects. Maybe putting a price on carbon, eventually.
Even though that might be politically tough right now.
It might be. This study acknowledges that many African governments are still focused on developing existing fossil fuel resources. So it also points to the need for global efforts, support from wealthier nations to help finance the transition.
But the core message from this study seems optimistic.
Very much so. The key finding, reiterated throughout this study, is that Africa can leapfrog that carbon-intensive development phase. It can use its own low-cost renewables, develop green hydrogen, build a self-sufficient, potentially exporting green economy. The potential is there, but, as this study notes, building the local capacity to make it happen is still a challenge to address.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive into contextualizing the scope, scale, and speed of energy pathways towards sustainable development in Africa. The really powerful takeaway is that this true zero-emission path isn't just wishful thinking. This study makes a strong case that it's technically feasible and, remarkably, could actually be the more cost-effective route for Africa compared to sticking with fossil fuels.
That's the core message. It positions Africa not just as needing to adapt to climate change, but as a potential leader, a major player in the future green global economy.
It really does give you a lot to chew on. You start thinking, what are the ripple effects? If this study's analysis holds true for Africa, what could it mean for energy transitions in other parts of the developing world? And what's the role for international cooperation in actually making this sustainable future a reality? Something to consider. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.